I'm Bill Southworth. I was in Nigeria, in a town known as Funtua, which is now a city, and I arrived January 6th, 1963, and served the 2 years, which was the only time we were allowed to serve, December 1964. Because at the back of my mind, I had this idea, having studied African history and politics for a number of years before joining the Peace Corps. I thought here was an opportunity to introduce the students to their own history. But I also realized that they needed to learn to trust me as a teacher and trust me as a person. And one of the things that I found made an enormous difference in that case was learning more about their lives. So if they were to say something in class and it had nothing to do with, say, history, which is what I was teaching, history and health science and French and athletics. As you know, you do everything when you're teaching over there. I found that that helped them to begin to develop a connection. I could develop a connection with them by being interested in their lives. And in the process, they were much more willing to then to start to learn history, which was often considered to be a very dull thing. But I wanted to make it something that they really, really would enjoy and really love. So during the school leaving times, vacation basically, I, with another guy, we set up a training program for enhancing people's Hausa language, because those of us who were in the boondocks were able to help those who were in the cities to catch up on their Hausa. Secondly, the next school leaving time, I went down to the University of Ibadan, as I had developed what I consider to be an African history, West African history language curriculum, history curriculum that I showed to them, and they liked it well enough to say, we'd like to use this. And I said, well, I'm about to use it with my students. So the second year, in January of '64, I said, I'd like you to learn your own history. And I knew right away that if you changed anything, you could be run out of town, because this was their one chance for an education. So I said, look, I can promise you that you will have, when you take your school leaving exams, you will have an opportunity to either take British Empire history, which was the standard one, or secondly, you could take West African history for your final examination. I said, that's a promise, you can do that. What I'd like you to do is to start to learn your own language, your own history rather. I keep thinking of language. So I started a process which actually is something I used much later, and in one case in this country it's still going 27 years later, after I turned it over to Antioch University. And the idea was to give them a real problem. In this case, since it was oral tradition, to be able to turn that into written tradition. In other words, a history of their villages. And that's a very memorable thing in terms of what it kind of got started. And also a love for teaching got started there as well. And the students were a big part of that. So the average time that a teacher will wait for an answer from the students, according to Columbia Teachers College, is 2 seconds. I waited 20 minutes. Because after I had explained what I was going to be doing, I wanted them to write histories of their own villages when they went on their school leaving, their school leaving time, their vacation, which was a month, and they went back to their own villages. I said, we need to prepare for that, and we have a couple of months to do that. So they waited, ready to write something down. And I said, so how would you begin to do this study of your own history, of your own village. And nobody responded. They were waiting for me to say something. Finally, after 20 minutes, one of them raised his hand and said, "Sir," they would always say sir, couldn't change that, "could we ask old people?" So I wrote on the board, "Ask old people," and there was an audible, "Oh my God, he's finally stopped being Wawa," which means crazy, Bature, white man or European. And he's come to his senses. And they all wrote it down immediately, which I knew they would. Then I said, "Who else would you ask?" And there was this audible, "Oh my God, here we go again." Wallahi talahi, as they would say in Hausa. But it only took 5 minutes then. They said, "Sir, could we ask the chief?" And it was dealing with an educational system which has been the love of my life. That's why I'm focusing on this in particular, that basically puts the teacher in the position. So it's about teaching. It's not necessarily about learning. So they would expect you to tell them what they needed to learn, and you would then lecture, you'd have them read things, and you'd test them on those things. And I believe that it really, if I wanted them to really learn about history, I had to put them in a position where they would have to be historians, basically. And there was an opportunity there because, as I mentioned earlier, everything was oral tradition, I mean, in the villages. So, and the storyteller, by the way, was the third most important person in the village. He was the village historian. I learned that from my students, because it was a lesson for me to go through all of the things that they began to tell me when I said, you know, how would you begin and how would you do this? So by the end of that time, when they were ready to go, they were ready. When they were ready to go back to their villages for a month, they were really ready. Years later, yes?
Another point is, who were the first two? If the storyteller was the third, why don't you include in
the chief?
Yeah.
Sorry.
The most important was...
The most important was the chief.
Okay.
The second most important was the religious leader, or a religious teacher, depending on what they did in terms of what their title would be. Not necessarily an imam, but very often an imam. It was a large enough village or town that they came from. And the third person was the storyteller. He basically was the person who was the village historian. But again, it was all oral tradition, going back, in many cases, hundreds of years. And in many cases, quite accurate when it was kind of checked out later on by looking at lunar eclipses and solar eclipses and matching those up with their understanding of what it was. So I felt it was information they could trust. Anyway, they came back at the end of a month with these wonderful notebooks with illustrations in colored pencils that they had used, and just fascinating stories that they had of so-called myths, like this rock would call out if an enemy was approaching. And they were so fascinating that at the next time we had time off, I went out and I visited several of the villages to see more about what they had been telling me about, to have them take me places. And it was just, you know, to me, very much a part of my own education about their culture. So that was, you know, one of the more memorable times. I also think of the first headmaster. We had 3 headmasters while I was there. It was the second headmaster, actually. The first one, Peter McNeely, was about to retire and go back to England. So he was British, obviously. A wonderful headmaster. And the second headmaster who came in was much younger, and he was kind of full of piss and vinegar. And he, it was time to sort the boys out according to A or B, or Section A, Section B. And what he did was, to that first day of school for the second year, he lined all the kids up by height. And my jaw was hanging down because I saw what he was about to do. He divided them, this is section A, this is section B. And I knew by that time that section A were the bright kids, supposedly, and section B were supposedly the not so bright kids. After he had done this, he went back to his office. I went into his office immediately. I was ripped. And I said, "You have got to be kidding." He said, "About what?" And he said, I said, "About dividing them up according to their height and calling that they're the bright kids and the short ones and the tall ones are not." He said, "Watch what happens." Well, that was before I knew about Rosenberg's self-fulfilling prophecy work at Harvard. I wish I knew about it at that time. In some ways, it actually worked to an advantage because I flipped it on its head. I was not about to have those B kids be treated or seen in any different way than the A kids. They were all going to learn, and they all did. They all passed with flying colors. And that has been something I've used ever since. Don't get sucked in by that. And sure enough, there were just all kinds of shifts that I made later on, because sometimes you had to adjust in terms of how you would approach the bees. I mean, they were more difficult, but the bees were finally the ones that I found took more time, took more patience. But I was able to shift a number of kids around from B into A. We had more A's. Ended up having more A's and fewer B's, but so we could kind of tailor that according to their needs. But I was amazed by that whole thing. That was a memory I just remembered. And lastly, the third headmaster was a Nigerian. And I was delighted with that. The boys were not. The students were not. And it took a long time to convince them that, they should be proud of the fact that this was a Nigerian man who was the headmaster. They thought they were getting less of an education because it wasn't British. Because this was just a short time after independence from the British Empire. So there was still a tremendous influence by the British. Like British Empire history was the history until introduced this other option. But they still were going to be learning British Empire history in there later on, after I had gone. So we worked very closely with him, and both Jeff and I spent a lot of time, getting the kids to really trust this man, and after a while they did. And he was a very, very good educator. So that's a wonderful memory.